All right, so you've sent us some pretty fascinating articles about Australian politics and economics, and I gotta say the insights here are, well, they're juicy. It's this whole mix of like policy analysis and voter sentiment, and even a bit of who's playing who as we head into the 2025 election.
Yeah, it's a real potent mix, you know. And for me, what's really interesting is how these issues that seem separate on the surface, like housing affordability and interest rates, even the whole fight against scams, they're all kind of intertwined.
Right, they all feed into that feeling that a lot of Australians have right now, that sense of unease.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, so we're diving deep today into 5 different opinion pieces. We've got sources like The Australian, The Guardian, even Crikey. So we're really getting a broad range of viewpoints here.
Absolutely. It's a really diverse set of voices, each with their own take on how these issues are impacting the country and the political landscape.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One issue that's clearly dominating the headlines is housing affordability. And Jacqueline Maley from the Sydney Morning Herald, she doesn't mince words. She calls it the defining issue of the upcoming election. She paints this really vivid picture of a generation that's basically locked out of the housing market, older Australians who are worried sick about their children's future, and a system that just seems to be failing people across the board.
Yeah, and I think that's where that pressure cooker analogy that Maley uses is so powerful because it's not just about Price is Right. It's about the underlying anxieties and frustrations, all those things that are building up within different parts of society. Young people are putting off those big life milestones. Parents feel helpless watching their kids struggle, and even older Australians are starting to question whether they can actually have a comfortable retirement. It's a multifaceted crisis that touches on everything from economic security to social mobility, even mental health.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like everyone's feeling the heat, but in different ways. And then you've got the government stepping in with what some are calling a Band-Aid solution, Labor's decision to ban foreign buyers for 2 years.
Right.
Catherine Murphy, who's a political editor known for her pretty sharp analysis, she writes in The Guardian that this ban is more about optics than real impact. She calls it, and this is a direct quote, politically popular but economically marginal.
And that's where things get really interesting, because on the surface, it seems like a decisive move, right? Cracking down on those foreign investors, protecting Australian homes for Australians. But like Murphy points out, the actual scale of foreign investment in the housing market, it's relatively small. So is this really a genuine attempt to tackle affordability? Or is it more about the government trying to look proactive, tapping into that public anxiety and saying, hey, look, we're doing something?
I'm sensing a theme here. It's like both major parties are resorting to these populist strategies, these moves that might score some political points but don't really address the root cause of the problems.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation. And it's something we're seeing in other areas as well. Take the recent interest rate cut by the Reserve Bank. They're hoping for a soft landing for the economy, trying to ease the pressure from inflation without triggering a recession. But Dennis Shanahan from The Australian, he argues that a rate cut on its own, it won't necessarily translate into votes for the government.
So you're saying that even if the economy starts to improve, voters might not give the current government credit? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
But voters are more sophisticated than we often give them credit for. They don't just look at economic indicators in isolation. They take into account all sorts of factors, leadership competence, how those economic changes are actually impacting their day-to-day lives. A rate cut might offer some relief, but it doesn't just erase all the anxieties that people have been feeling.
So it's all about perception and narrative.
Exactly. And this brings us to another example of what could be seen as a populist play. Peter Dutton's threat to, quote, break up big insurance companies if they don't lower their premiums. Sean Carney in The Age calls it a populist gamble. And I think that's a pretty accurate description.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. On the one hand, I can see how Dutton's tapping into a real frustration that's out there. People are fed up with these sky-high insurance costs. They feel like they're being gouged by these big corporations.
Right, and that's exactly why it's such a politically savvy move. But Carney points out that interfering with the market like that, it can have unintended consequences. He gives examples from other countries where they tried to control insurance companies, and it actually backfired. Prices went up even higher, or coverage was reduced.
So Dutton's plan could actually end up hurting the very people he's trying to protect.
That's the danger with these populist plays. They might sound good in a soundbite, but they can have all these complex ramifications that politicians don't always anticipate. And it raises a really important question. Are these policies driven by a genuine desire to help people? Or are they primarily about scoring political points?
It does feel like a lot of Australians are feeling increasingly vulnerable, both economically and in terms of their sense of security, and that vulnerability makes them more open to these populist appeals.
You've hit on a really crucial point. This feeling of vulnerability, It's not just limited to the physical world. It extends to the digital realm as well, which is where the whole issue of scams comes into play. Australia just passed the Scams Prevention Framework Bill, and while a lot of people are celebrating it as a major victory, Bernard Keane from Crikey, he raises a pretty provocative question. What about the companies whose lax security practices are actually making these scams possible in the first place?
So instead of just focusing on the scammers, we should be holding the companies accountable.
Exactly. That's Keane's argument. He points to all the recent data breaches in Australia. Millions of people's personal information has been compromised, and he argues that companies need to take data security much, much more seriously. He even suggests that in some cases, executives who are negligent, they should face criminal charges.
Wow, that's a bold proposition. It raises a lot of questions about how far we should go in holding companies responsible for data breaches.
It's definitely a complex issue and one that we're going to have to grapple with more and more as we become increasingly reliant on digital technologies.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, and it's clear that Australia is facing some pretty significant challenges.
Yeah, it feels like we're at this crossroads. There's this underlying current of anxiety running through all these issues. It's like the systems we relied on, they're not really working the way they used to. You've really hit on something important there. We're seeing it everywhere. The housing market, the economy, this rise of populism, even how technology is changing our lives. It's a time of big change. And it makes sense that people are feeling a little uncertain.
And I think it's in those moments of uncertainty when people are looking for those quick fixes, those easy answers that promise to bring back some kind of order.
Absolutely. When people are anxious, they're drawn to those strong voices, those leaders who sound decisive, even if their policies are more about style than substance. It's about tapping into those fears and offering a sense of hope, even if it's a false hope.
Right. So how do we break out of this cycle? How do we get past the fear and the rhetoric and actually start addressing these challenges in a way that's meaningful, in a way that will actually last?
Well, I don't think there's one easy answer. Part of it, I think, is acknowledging just how complex these issues really are, recognizing that there's no magic bullet for the housing crisis or for guaranteeing everyone's economic security.
Yeah, we can't just nab our fingers and make these problems disappear.
Exactly. It takes a more nuanced approach, a willingness to work with the messy realities, and maybe even accepting that some of these solutions, they might take time.
Right, they're not overnight fixes. And that brings us to the idea of individual responsibility. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, to just throw up your hands and say, it's too big, what can I do? But we all have a role to play in shaping a better future.
I think that's a really critical point, because if we just focus on the problems, it's easy to feel powerless. But if we shift our attention to what we can control, even if it's something small, it opens up new possibilities. It lets us be active in shaping our own lives and the communities we live in.
So you're saying that even small actions can make a difference?
Absolutely. It's about staying informed, having constructive conversations, holding our elected officials accountable. It's about being mindful consumers, supporting our local businesses, thinking critically about the information we see every day.
What I'm hearing is it's not about waiting for someone else to come and rescue us. It's about taking ownership, becoming active citizens who are engaged in creating the future we want.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have agency, that our choices matter, and that even when things feel daunting, we can make a difference.
I love that. It's empowering, isn't it? Instead of feeling helpless, we can choose to be proactive, to be part of the solution.
Exactly. And it's not about pretending that the problems don't exist or being overly optimistic. It's about acknowledging the challenges, but also believing that we can overcome them together.
This conversation has really shifted my perspective. I'm starting to see these articles less as a source of anxiety and more as a call to action.
I think that's a really great takeaway. Because knowledge without action, it's just information. But when we use that knowledge to make decisions, to change our behavior, to be more engaged, that's when it becomes truly powerful.
Okay, so let's get practical. What are some things our listeners can do to become more engaged, more empowered citizens?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Read from a variety of news sources, not just the ones that agree with you. Challenge yourself to understand different perspectives, even if you don't agree with them.
And don't just read passively. Talk about it with your friends, your family, your coworkers, share what you're learning, ask questions, have those debates. Don't be afraid to get a little uncomfortable.
Exactly. Turn information into knowledge, and then turn that knowledge into action. Support organizations that are working on the issues you care about. Volunteer, donate, write to your elected officials.
And when it comes to the economy, be a mindful consumer. Think before you make those big purchases. Support your local businesses as much as you can, and think about the ethics and the environmental impact of your spending.
Those are all fantastic suggestions. And don't forget the power of community. Connect with your neighbors, get involved in local initiatives, build those networks of support. Because when we work together, we're much stronger than when we try to face these challenges alone.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like we've gone beyond just summarizing these articles. We've really explored those deeper themes and what they mean for all of us.
It's always great to have these kinds of discussions, to really grapple with complex ideas and explore different solutions.
Yeah, and I think our listeners will appreciate the depth and nuance we've brought to these topics.
I hope so. And I hope they'll leave feeling not just informed, but empowered, ready to take action and make a difference in their communities.
So we've talked a lot about the big picture, the systemic challenges, and the individual responses, but I think it would be valuable to look at some of the specific recommendations that these authors have made. They've offered some really interesting ideas about how to actually address these issues. Okay, so let's dive into some of those solutions. We talked about housing affordability being a major issue, and there are a lot of opinions on how to fix it. Catherine Murphy, for example, she argues that just banning foreign buyers, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Right? It's not going to cut it.
Yeah. She says we need to think bigger, be bolder, and really focus on boosting the supply of housing.
Murphy's advocating for a multi-pronged approach. She talks about increasing the availability of land for development, streamlining the planning processes, and investing, like really investing in social and affordable housing options. And she's really emphasizing collaboration, too, getting the federal and state governments on the same page.
That makes a lot of sense. It does feel like a systemic issue that needs a systemic response, not just these little tweaks around the edges. And it sounds like she's not the only one who thinks that way. Jacqueline Maley also calls for some big structural reforms. She even suggests that the party that comes up with the most convincing housing plan, that could be what wins them the 2025 election.
That's a really interesting point about the political side of things. Voters are getting more and more frustrated with the lack of progress on this issue. They're looking for leaders who have a clear vision, who are willing to take some risks and make big changes. It's not enough to just offer symbolic gestures anymore. People want to see real, tangible change.
So what could those structural reforms actually look like? Could we see something like a massive government-led housing construction program?
It's definitely possible. We could also see policies that encourage private developers to build more affordable units, maybe through tax breaks or incentives for higher density. Another option could be stricter regulations on short-term rentals like Airbnb to free up more housing for people who actually live here. There are a lot of tools the government can use, but it's going to take political will, and they'll have to navigate all those complex interests between different levels of government and the private sector.
It sounds like a huge undertaking, but the potential benefits socially and economically could be enormous.
Absolutely. And this is where that idea of individual agency comes in again. We can't just sit back and wait for the government to solve this. We need to be informed voters, participate in these discussions happening in our communities, advocate for policies that support affordable housing, and hold our elected officials accountable to actually make this a priority.
Right, make them follow through on their promises. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We also talked about the economy and that interest rate cut from the Reserve Bank. What are some other things the government can do to try and stabilize the economy?
Well, fiscal policy is a big one. Basically, that means adjusting government spending and taxation to try and influence how the economy is doing. For example, they could increase spending on infrastructure projects, which would create jobs and stimulate demand. Or they could give tax breaks to businesses and individuals, putting more money back into the economy.
But those measures, they come with their own risks, don't they? Increased spending could lead to higher deficits, and tax cuts, while they sound good, could actually make inequality worse if they're not designed carefully.
You're absolutely right. It's a delicate balancing act. The government has to weigh the potential benefits of stimulating the economy against the potential downsides. And again, this is where a well-informed public debate is so crucial. We need to hold our leaders accountable for making responsible decisions about the economy, not just going for those short-term fixes that could have negative consequences down the road.
And finally, let's go back to that issue of scams and corporate accountability. Bernard Keene's argument about holding executives criminally responsible for data breaches, that was really something to think about. It seems like there's this tension building between the need for innovation in the digital world and the need to protect people from the harm that can happen when their data is compromised.
It's definitely a complicated issue and one that we're all still trying to figure out. On one hand, having stronger deterrence could force companies to take data security more seriously. But we also have to be careful not to create a climate of fear that stifles innovation, because taking risks is really important for economic growth and progress.
Maybe there's a way to find a middle ground. Perhaps we need tougher regulations, better ways to enforce those regulations without going straight to criminal charges in every case. We might also see a move towards more proactive measures, like companies being required to notify people about data breaches, or having data security audits for companies that handle a lot of sensitive information.
Those are all good points. The key is to strike that balance between protecting consumers and making sure businesses can still thrive. And at the end of the day, it's up to us as citizens to demand that our leaders and our businesses prioritize both innovation and responsibility.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. It's clear that Australia's got some big challenges ahead: economic uncertainty, political maneuvering, this constantly changing digital world. But I think the biggest takeaway for me has been the power of individual action. We're not just watching from the sidelines. We can actually shape the future, even in small ways.
You've summed it up perfectly. It's about staying informed, engaging in these important conversations, being thoughtful about what we buy, and holding our leaders accountable. It's about recognizing that we all have a part to play in creating a more just equitable and sustainable future.
It's not about giving up or feeling hopeless. It's about hope, it's about action, and it's about believing that we can make a difference together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. 1099.